Oh, that's it. I've had it with this dump. We got no food. We got no jobs. Our pets' heads are falling off. Okay, just calm down.
Welcome back to Thinking Critical. This is Wes, and it's time for the Viewer's Choice comic review. And this week, you guys chose Annihilation Scourge, Beta Ray Bill. I was somewhat interested in this comic basically because of the writer. Michael Moreci is a pretty good writer, and he actually wrote one of my favorite Nightwing comics of all time, Nightwing 43. Check that, my favorite Nightwing comic of all time, Nightwing 43. I talked about that comic a little bit with Josh in our recent Nightwing conversation, and I do plan on actually doing a review on the channel sometime in January. The artist on Beta Ray Bill is Alberto Alburquerque. Not really sure who he is. I'm pretty certain that I probably read comics with his art in it. I read a lot of comics, but his art's never really made an impact, and I don't really recognize the name. Full disclosure, I'm not reading Annihilation Scourge. I don't really like Marvel Comics events right now. I don't like the way that they're rolling them out. These 5-week events with 8 comics, I don't like the format. I don't like the way they do 4-issue mini events like Contagion in 4 consecutive weeks or 5 consecutive weeks, or whatever it was. So I personally don't really like the way Marvel has been doing these events like 2099, Annihilation Scourge, to end 2019. But I do like Beta Ray Bill. He's a cool character, and he's been getting a lot of play in Donny Cates as far as Death of the Inhumans. And he's also been in his Guardians of the Galaxy series, which I actually like a lot, but it's actually kind of sputtered down the stretch, in my opinion. So I came into this comic with no prior knowledge of the series. I'm also personally not a fan of Matthew Rosenberg, who's basically overseeing the Annihilation Scourge series. He wrote the Alpha issue, he wrote the Omega issue, and I think he wrote the Fantastic Four. I can't remember. But I don't think Rosenberg's a very good writer, and that's another reason I didn't really pick up the series. Although the other 3 writers on it, Dan Abnett, Christos Gage, and Michael Moreci, I do think are good. So if Dan Abnett was in charge, I probably would have read this, or even Christos Gage, because he's actually one of my favorite writers. So I came into this comic without reading the previous Annihilation Scourge comics, and I had really low expectations, if I had any at all. As far as this comic goes, I don't recommend it. I don't think it's a very good read, and I'm going to get into the details in today's comic book review. The art by Alberto Alburquerque actually starts out pretty good at the beginning when an evil Sentry shows up and Beta Ray Bill and Lockjaw fight like an enormous dragon. It's actually pretty cool, but it gets noticeably worse as the comic book goes along. The visuals get murky, and Alburquerque stopped adding a lot of details to the pages. I didn't really like that very much, so it started out good and it got progressively worse. I don't normally talk about the letterer, but I hate the lettering in this comic. I think it's really hard to read, especially the inner monologue from Beta Ray Bill. I don't like the font that they use. I don't like the size. But all around, I think the lettering is subpar. And the letterer on this comic is Joe Sabino. Not sure who that is, but I think he did a poor job here. There are a lot of splash pages in this comic, which is generally good for the artist, but generally indicates the writing isn't there, or maybe the story was too short to actually fill up the entire comic, so they started using a bunch of splash pages. That's kind of what it looks like here. I can't really blame that on the artist, but there are a ton of double-page splashes on this comic, and it doesn't really warrant it. There are a couple of events that maybe warranted a double-page splash, but definitely not as many as in this comic. Overall, I don't really like the art. I think it's subpar. It definitely gets worse as the comic goes along, and I'll rate the art 2 out of 5. Michael Moreci's characterization is probably the best part of this comic, and even that's not very good. There's a lot of really bad humor, just kind of teenage fart joke humors at the beginning of the book, and none of them really paid off for me. I didn't really enjoy any of the jokes. When Lockjaw destroys the dragon at the beginning of the book, they're covered in slime, and apparently it's smelly. Haha, that's so funny. And then after Beta Ray Bill and Lockjaw save the planet from the dragon, they treat him to a hero celebration, and they're feeding him drinks and food, and he gets bored. So they create a fake monster to try and get him to stay. It's really stupid, like I said, especially the beginning of this book is just really off. It does pick up and get better as it goes along. But, I really like Beta Ray Bill and Lockjaw. They come off as really boring here. They get a couple of moments at the end, but the dialogue isn't very good. Donny Cates definitely has a better handle on both of those characters, in my opinion, than Michael Moreci, who's a writer I like, so I was a little bit disappointed in that as well. During the introduction in the comic that kind of gets you caught up on the Annihilation Scourge event, there's one really interesting part of it, and it's the Revengers, which are basically the Avengers from the Cancerverse, which is part of this story. So I was actually really interested to see the Revengers, but we only get 2 characters from that, evil versions of Sentry and Doctor Strange. Doctor Strange is basically wiped out immediately. Sentry actually seems really strong. He comes on at the end, and he forces Beta Ray Bill to make a personal sacrifice, which is probably the highlight of the entire book. But overall, the characterization isn't really good. Beta Ray Bill doesn't stand out as really cool. Lockjaw's kind of lame in this book. Evil Doctor Strange is not powerful at all. The only character that really stood out as cool was Sentry, in my opinion. But, like I said, the characterization is probably the best part of the comic. I'll rate it 3 out of 5. Michael Moreci's Annihilation Scourge Beta Ray Bill plot is probably the low point of the comic. The intro, with the exception of the Revengers part that I already talked about, makes the event feel really unimportant. When you read it, you want to put the comic down immediately. It does not feel like anything important is happening in this comic, which is such a shame because Dan Abnett did such a great job with the original Annihilation event. There's lots of talk of the positive zone, the negative zone, and the Cancerverse. They mention so many different dimensions in this comic, they all kind of bleed together. Yeah, I get it, the negative zone and the Cancerverse are probably the bad parts, and the positive zone is probably the good part, but I don't know, it just didn't really get me interested in the book. After the original confrontation between Beta Ray Bill, Lockjaw, and this enormous dragon, the book moves to a grinding halt. It gets exceptionally boring, and Beta Ray Bill is standing on the planet saying, "I'm so bored, I want something to happen." And I felt exactly what he was feeling. I was bored. I wanted something to happen. And the pacing of this story is just really all over the place. It's not a fun comic to read. I felt like I was having to work to get through it. And that's never the feeling you want when you're reading a comic book. The basic plot is Annihilus escaped the negative zone by creating a crease between that and the positive zone. Although Annihilus isn't in this comic, and this is allowing entities from the negative zone to pass over into the positive zone, and Beta Ray Bill and Lockjaw had to fight him off and send him back. Not the greatest plot in the world, but the story didn't have to be this boring and ill-paced. There is one good event at the very end of the book. When Sentry passes from the negative zone into the positive zone, Beta Ray Bill has to make a sacrifice by sending Stormbreaker into Sentry to send him back to the negative zone, and he loses his powers, and he and Lockjaw have to go into the negative zone to retrieve his hammer, which basically sends him in motion into the final chapter of the event, which I believe is Annihilation Scourge Omega, coming out next week. That's really the only cool thing that happens in the entire story. Like I said, it's oddly paced, it's not very exciting. The intro made the event seem not important. The comic itself made the event seem not important. I'm personally glad I'm not reading Annihilation Scourge because this wasn't all that great. I'll rate the plot 2 out of 5 overall. Before I wrap this comic review up, I do want to talk about Alien vs. Predator, Thicker Than Blood, another comic that was up for the vote, but didn't quite make it. There's one very interesting character. He's a very young android that will never grow up, and I'm very interested to see where they take that character and they take the story. But overwhelmingly, the standout feature is the art from Doug Wheatley. If you like Alien vs. Predator, if you like those kind of graphics, you'll probably want to read this comic. It's actually much better than Annihilation Scourge Beta Ray Bill, and it's something I would recommend. It's not the greatest comic in the world. Like I said, the story has promise, but it has a long way to go before it meets that. But the art from Doug Wheatley is very good. There's some really good gruesome stuff, and there's a really weird S&M alien at the very end of the book. I think you should check it out. If you like Alien vs. Predators, you're probably going to like that comic. So overall, I came away very unimpressed with the art, the characterization, and the plot in Annihilation Scourge Beta Ray Bill. The event doesn't seem very important. This comic is really not very fun to read. I'll rate it 2.5 out of 5 overall. I do not recommend this comic, and in the future, I'm probably not going to offer up any more DC or Marvel books for the viewer choice. They're probably going to be more independent comics, stuff from Boom, Image, IDW. I want to review more independent comics, but it's really hit or miss on knowing what people actually want reviews on. So I'm probably going to focus the viewer choice reviews on independent comics moving forward. Thank you all so much for joining me today, and I'll see you tomorrow.